The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with another installment of GeoEngineering Watch Radio Global Alert News for October 3rd, 2015. The constant circus of insanity continues from all sides, and in spite of the fact that we have converging catastrophes coming from every direction, on every front, if you will, we have the typical, let's do our CNN top story update so we can compare. It's important to compare just how disconnected from reality modern society is, most of modern society. Sorry if that's offensive, it's a fact. It's an absolute fact. And the vast majority of people are in that category. And I certainly don't want or relish the task of trying to bring some of these truths out, as others are, and I salute all those that are trying. I am very grateful for everyone who's trying to bring these truths to light. It's not something we want to do. This is certainly not something I wanted to do. I don't have commercials on this news show because I didn't do this news show for any sort of revenue or personal gain. I've spent my entire SEP retirement account over the last 10 years in this endeavor, and it's the right use of any resources that any of us have to try to bring to light certain truths while we still can, while it still matters, to try to point out to the crew of the ship that there's a giant hole in the bottom, many giant holes. If we don't plug those holes, the ship will sink. The ship is sinking now. We're all knee-deep in water on the deck of the Titanic. So well, all this is going on. And again, the catastrophes around the globe we've talked about in previous episodes. I'll talk about more of those today, from Fukushima to the ongoing climate engineering nightmare to wars of aggression around the globe, resource depletion, refugees. We have crop failure, marine ecosystem failure. I could go on and on and on. But what does CNN have to say for the week? This should be a barometer of just how, again, disconnected our society is from reality. Here's CNN's top stories, some of them. GOP smarts after McCarthy's slip. We have U.S., Russia, Syria strikes a blunder. Well, of course the U.S. thinks that, because it's okay for the U.S. to bomb people. In fact, recently a wedding party got bombed by U.S. ally Saudi Arabia, killed 38. And how many wedding parties were bombed by U.S. drones? It's okay for the U.S. to bomb anybody, anywhere, anytime. But if someone else does it, then it's automatically unacceptable. It's unacceptable to the United States for that to happen. And I'm not siding with Russia. I'm simply saying that we have a level of hypocrisy here that is truly mind-numbing. And when we look at, as I've stated in previous episodes, the amount of countries that have been invaded by the U.S. in the last 50 years, it's about 50. And when we look at the countries that are demonized, like Iran, in the last 230 years has invaded no one. So again, we should look past our preconceptions and look for truth. Some more headlines from CNN. CNN, team name not offensive, Bush says. I don't even know what that's about, but who cares? Bush to Trump, wear big boy pants. What kind of political theater and idiocracy is this? Clinton leads Sanders in poll, who cares? Donald Trump, if I tank, I'll drop out. Killer moms, chilling final words. Powerball winner, Dunkin' Donuts to close 100 stores. Another sign of our flourishing economy, by the way, which is a total facade. I'll get to more of that later in the show. We'll talk about ghost cities in China, which a lot of people don't know about. And again, which deserve highlighting again, because it's an epitome of what the industrialized military complex is doing to keep the facade of industrialized society going a little bit longer. We have car companies that appear to be buying their own cars to keep their numbers up. We'll get to more of that later in the show. A few more headlines from CNN. This caddy is making a fortune. How important would that be? We have how Shonda Rhimes lost 117 pounds. I don't even have the words for this. I think if some outside source of life was watching corporate media, they would quickly conclude there's no intelligent life on this planet. And I'm not saying there is some alternate source of life. I'm just simply pointing out an example that, given all we have happening on our planet, you think the human race might be a little bit concerned about its own survival. But instead we have more headlines like this from CNN. No-show wedding guest gets bill. Squirrel bite. There's a code for that. Coach finds out he's fired on Facebook. Kayak proves irresistible to bear. It's beyond belief. It's beyond comprehension. The last couple of headlines. MTV star dies in skydiving accident. Rock's pup eats mushroom, dies. I could go on and on. Truly, we're swimming in a sea of insanity. And those who get their daily meal of information from the corporate media are missing the point, and they're failing in any sense of responsibility toward their own children, the human race, and the responsibility to assist with the common good. So while we have major catastrophes going on, like we discussed last week, the catastrophic contamination from Fukushima, which is mounting by the day, mainstream media completely blocking out that story. And it's not just Fukushima, by the way. Many falsely believe that Chernobyl is all taken care of. It's all put to bed. Couldn't be further from the truth. Chernobyl, the sarcophagus that contains Chernobyl, is disintegrating. Nuclear contamination has very catastrophic effects. It's very hard to contain that kind of contamination because it tends to disintegrate containers, and this holds to concrete as well. So while we have astoundingly nuclear energy pushed as some sort of green energy or as a source of renewable energy, this is not reality. The cataclysms caused by the nuclear nightmare on so many fronts are manifesting themselves by the day. In fact, as we discussed last week, Fukushima alone could exterminate life on planet if it continues long enough. And again, there's no known technology to deal with that situation. Really no known technology to deal with the situation in Chernobyl or other situations around the globe that are likely to develop. So as we head into this week, just to cover one thing that's also a recap on the cyclones, the hurricanes that are happening around the globe. We now have Cyclone Joaquin spinning up, and it's important to remember what we went over last week. Hurricane suppression technology is real and being utilized. So, as we discussed, we've had a 10-year, 119-month drought on major hurricane impact landfalls in the U.S., even though we've had record cyclones elsewhere in the globe, as we should have, with record ocean temperatures. So now, suddenly, we have Cyclone Joaquin shaping up somewhat like Hurricane Sandy, slowly making its way up the eastern seaboard with nobody really knowing where it's going. And keep in mind, when we know that cyclone suppression technology exists, and we know cyclones have been actively suppressed in the U.S., what's happening now? Like Cyclone Sandy, or Hurricane Sandy, was that a demonstration of the power the geoengineers have? Again, in the case of Hurricane Sandy, how in the world could they have known that that cyclone would make an unprecedented 90-degree westerly turn a week before it happened? People need to look through the smoke and mirrors here. This is weather warfare, period. Whether we're talking about the protracted drought on the U.S. West or the Cyclone Joaquin that has yet to reveal what damage it may or may not do. Hurricanes don't just stop magically. After the pounding years of 2004, 2005, ocean temperatures warmer now, conditions even more conducive for cyclones, and they just stopped. Now, again, we'll see what Cyclone Joaquin does, but the U.S., or those who run the U.S., do whatever they deem is beneficial to them. Has nothing to do with the common good. This holds true with weather modification or weather warfare. It holds true with the U.S. allies. So what we don't have CNN covering, for example, is what about the Saudi beheadings? Saudi Arabia just beheaded about a dozen people, hung them from cranes in one of their cities, headless bodies hanging in the air, and this is a U.S. ally. Saudi Arabia just killed 38 civilians, a wedding party in Yemen. Oops. We didn't hear much about that, did we? Not much at all, because we were too busy hearing about what kind of pants Donald Trump should wear. This is the society we live in. This is how controlled our media is. And when we hear people say, and I hear them say this a lot to me, people who I know and have a relationship with, whether they're friends or former friends, to say, oh, you found that on the internet. As if the internet is not the best single source of data we have. Yes, there's a lot of junk on the internet, of course. But you can also get straight to the horse's mouth. You can get right to, for example, science institutions that did the study. It doesn't go through the filter of corporate media. You can get right to the frontline data. So why would we not consider the internet the most credible source of finding data, as long as you find the right source? But yet the people who want to insinuate that anything found on the internet is not credible, and yet they're watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, and somehow they think they have a clue. That's a delusional world we live in. Absolutely delusional. So again, those types of people are watching the Donald Trump pant-wearing article, or the kayak that's interesting to the bear, or the coach that found out he was fired on Facebook. They're watching that and not seeing the fact that massive amounts of civilians are being slaughtered in wedding parties, that headless bodies are being hung in cities by our quote-unquote allies, and things that are missed like this. In fact, with all those people who claim to be patriotic and yet ignore the facts, in the case of Saudi Arabia, let's tie this in, how many people know that after 9/11, when the terrorists were supposedly from Saudi Arabia, how many people know that almost 100 Saudi nationals were the only people allowed to get in a plane and get a free ride home? No questions asked, no interviews done. How many people know that? What kind of an odor does that have? It's about money, it's about power, it's about resources. So again, while all this is going on and CNN is telling us how great the economy is, it's expanding and everything's fine and everybody go about their business, here's a few headlines. B of A to cut several hundred jobs. There's one. Hudson Bay Corporation cutting 265 jobs. Chesapeake Energy lays off 740. Shell Malaysia to axe 1,300 jobs. And as we said in last week's show, Caterpillar to axe 10,000 jobs. Well, those are signs of a great economy. A snake can only eat its tail for so long. The unemployment figure is totally fictitious, because when 200,000 or 300,000 people fall off the back end of the conveyor and no longer receive benefits, they no longer count. If they're not looking for a job, they no longer count. How many empty storefronts do we need to see to figure out that this is all a grand facade? It cannot go on much longer. And again, an epitome of the snake eating its own tail is the Chinese ghost cities. And for those who don't know what those are, I've covered this some in the past, but for those who don't know what they are, they're literally cities in China built with no inhabitants, built in order to keep the wheels of industrialized society turning, to keep the GDP numbers up, to keep the delusion of growth going. Here's an article from Forbes, or an excerpt from an article from Forbes magazine from July of this year. I'm quoting from the magazine article. From shopping malls to soccer stadiums, hundreds of new cities in China. Listen to that statement. Hundreds of new cities in China are largely empty. And yet more cities are still being built deep in the heart of the country, all in hopes that its rural population will one day moved to a flat in a city without a mayor. It's plausible, of course. That's because over the next 15 years, the country's urban population will be 1 billion, 3 times that of the United States. Now, this article assumes a lot. It assumes that everything will keep going along the next 15 years as it has, that somehow this is a linear equation, everything's predictable, and this is about as accurate as speeding on a car toward a cliff and making projections as to what you'll be doing as you're another 20 miles down the road. The road ends. You're not going to be doing anything. On this course, life will not be anything like it is, if there's life at all, in that 15-year period. As we went over in past shows, the species extinction rate, the current loss of species, if you just project that out, without things getting worse, and they are getting worse fast, you can't look at time horizons like this because they are irrelevant. They won't be a factor. Let's look at energy. Again, with all of this is connected. Everything is connected. These resource wars, the climate and resource refugees from bombed out countries in pursuit of resources, everything is connected. And so much of it goes right back to the pursuit of energy. In the case of oil, what's important to understand is the oil that's left, and we have all these projections that we have enough oil for this many years or enough coal for that many years. But all that dialogue is again simply an illusion because it doesn't take into account any of the consequential factors that are manifesting from every direction. But largely it's what the population wants to hear because they don't want to wake up. They don't want to wake up to what's going on. So the pursuit of energy and resources is behind so much of the carnage we see around the planet. In the year 1900, 1 barrel of energy could remove 100 from the ground. The energy was very easy to get. That's an actual figure. So that ease of recovering energy has changed dramatically. Today, it takes approximately 1 barrel of hydrocarbon to remove 7 from the ground, which means it's exponentially harder to get at that oil. It's much more energy intensive, so you're spending a great deal more energy to get the energy in the first place. It starts to head toward a net negative. Like tar sands, for example, they're an energy net negative. What does that mean? It means it takes about 1.4 units of energy to get 1 out of the ground. It's a net loss. Why would they do it? Because they have an excess of natural gas and they want the fossil fuel for actual hydrocarbon fuel gasoline production. So they're using their excess natural gas to convert the tar sands to oil at a very big net loss. How smart is that? And what about the fracking nightmare? That's got to be the epitome of human insanity as well, in addition to climate engineering. Pumping 500 plus chemicals into the ground that don't even have to be disclosed. Let's think about that one. And that was a gift from Darth Cheney, by the way, and that should be his name. Darth Cheney fits him. Dick Cheney is as evil as they come. And all administrations, when I speak about one particular individual, I'm not on any political party. There are two sides to the same coin. Everyone should get that by now. So thanks to Dick Cheney, the fracking industry doesn't even have to disclose what they're pumping into the ground somewhere near your water well. You don't have to look hard to see the insanity in that. And how about desperate deep-sea drilling? Again, I'm pointing out all the resource wars. Going back to 9/11 as a license to be able to invade countries, to gain those resources, all these are connected. So when we look at the deep-sea drilling, again, yet another sign of the desperation to reach the remaining resources. And when someone speaks out about that, when someone really in the know speaks out, like Matt Simmons, encourage anybody to look up his name. Matt Simmons was the really undisputed foremost independent expert on deep-sea drilling. In regards to the Macondo oil well leak, Matt Simmons went on CNN News when the well was supposedly capped, and he stated on air that the well was still leaking that the seafloor had heaved, that they would probably never be able to cap that well. He was found 1 or 2 days later dead in his swimming pool. What a surprise. That's how the establishment deals with people who are truly in the know, that try to tell the truth, those on the inside who try to speak out. So the pursuit of energy continues. Many people think, quote-unquote, renewable energy will save us all. Is that really the case? And I'm not speaking completely critically against renewable energy. I am off-grid. I've been off-grid for 14 years. I have wind, solar, and hydro power, although none of them work nearly as well as they should, because let's go back to climate engineering. Climate engineering reduces sun, reduces wind, reduces rain. Now, if you're in a place where it's windy and rainy, please don't say, well, that can't be true because it's not happening here. That's a general, absolutely verifiable science fact. Less wind, less sun, less rain. Just because it's extra windy and rainy where you are is not a snapshot of the trend over the entire world. And on a warming world, by the way, rainfall should be increasing. And in places it is, because the atmosphere carries more moisture as it warms, as I've stated in the past, 7% more for every degree centigrade. So there will be deluges, ever-increasing deluges, and especially as the geoengineers are not able to keep up with the superheating planet with their constant aerosolization, which, again, diminishes sunlight, diminishes evaporation, and they're trying to cut down on atmospheric relative humidity. I was told that by one of the architects of these programs, Jim Phelps from Oak Ridge Labs, in direct conversation. That was one of their goals, to keep atmospheric relative humidity down, because water is a greenhouse gas. But anyway, as you're trying to generate renewable energy, how can you do this when you have climate engineering that's blocking the sun, reducing overall windfall for the wind turbines, or wind speeds, and reducing precipitation? So the bottom line is, with renewable energy, and those who think that that renewable energy is going to save us, or that we can just burn up all our fossil fuel and we'll just switch to renewables, that's a delusion as well. Total delusion. One, green energy is not so green. And we have gases used with the production of solar panels that are horrible for the atmosphere. Hexafluoroethane is 12,000 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. It's used in solar panel production. Nitrogen trifluoride, 17,000 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2, also used in solar panel production. And now we have also the wind farms that are popping up everywhere that people think just magically appear, and they don't consider all the fossil fuels it took to construct those wind farms, and the wind farms wear out quickly. Here's a headline. Germany, this is a new headline, by the way, Germany now faced with thousands of aging wind farms. The problem now is that a large number of the 25,000 odd turbines have become too old. This is right from the article, by the way. Close to 7,000 of those turbines will complete more than 15 years of operation by next year. Although these turbines can continue running with some minor repairs and modification, the question is whether it makes any economic sense to maintain them. Renewables were supposed to transport us into a new age of plentiful, clean energy and eliminate the need for fossil fuels. But the world is already littered with aging and end-of-life hardware. They wear out. Solar panels have a life expectancy as well. And that life expectancy is being radically shortened, by the way, due to the massively excessive UV. Another road leads right back to climate engineering, as I've stated earlier. So many roads lead back to climate engineering. So many destructive, negative consequences lead back to climate engineering. And that's going to increase radically as the system continues to unravel. And that's not to negate all the other factors contributing. The methane being released from the fracking wells is horrific. The burning of 4 billion with a B, gallons of hydrocarbon every single day. The cutting down of forests, as I stated earlier, we've lost 3.4 trillion trees since the dawn of civilization. That's 55% of the trees we had, by the way. All these add up, but climate engineering being the most negative of all. So the pursuit for resources continues. And back to the resource wars now. Let's weave this all back together, back to the resource wars. Here's a headline. How much mined material will we need to build a 100% renewable energy world? Again, that's the headline, but the renewable energy world is a delusion. Here's commentary on that. These numbers are staggering, the numbers of materials that would be needed. And as we've seen already, recycling of end-of-life hardware, i.e. recycling wind turbines or any other form of industrial worn-out waste, isn't as readily achieved as everyone believes and has been trained to believe. Further, there is the energy requirement for all of this, which involves much fossil fuel use. Renewable energy power systems are unsustainable in the long run, as is the entire industrialized societal model. And those who believe that this will stave off the collapse of the reality we've known are also not looking at reality. It's better, yes, renewable energy or quote-unquote renewable energy is better than a hydrocarbon society, but it's still only an energy extender. That's all. It's important for people to understand that. So again, back to the resource wars and Afghanistan and 9/11. Let's weave all this together. What was really also in Afghanistan that made it important to occupy? How about this headline? 1 trillion trove of rare minerals revealed under Afghanistan. A recent article. A little excerpt from that article. Despite being one of the poorest nations in the world, Afghanistan may be sitting on one of the richest troves of minerals in the world, valued at nearly 1 trillion, according to U.S. scientists. Well, they would know. They would know because certainly there's a reason we're in Afghanistan. 9/11 was the license under which all these invasions and occupations occurred. Resources are ultimately the goal. To keep this machine going, to keep the juggernaut of insanity going, and now we find out there is something, after all, in Afghanistan that was wanted. Just like the hydrocarbon reserves in Iraq. And in Iraq, by the way, and this is well documented, even some of the high U.S. military officials stated this on the record, that the decision to invade Iraq was made before 9/11. How big a red flag should that be? So that the open announcement of this occurred immediately after 9/11. Even though, as we now know, there was no connection. No connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, period. Whatever your viewpoint is on what actually happened on 9/11, and I've been over what the evidence points to in that regard, but even if you believe the quote-unquote official story about 9/11, there is virtually indisputable proof now that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it. But all these countries have something that is wanted by those in power. It's important to realize that. And when people go to those countries like Pat Tillman, those of you who don't know who Pat Tillman is, you should look him up and read about Pat Tillman, who signed up for U.S. Special Forces. He was a very, very promising football athlete, major contracts. He abandoned all that after 9/11, signed up, very intelligent individual, wanted to do his part for the common good, but quickly in Afghanistan became completely disillusioned at what he saw. He saw through the smoke and mirrors. Again, he was a very intelligent individual. If you read about Pat Tillman, a student of philosophy, exceptional individual. And he began to make known that he was going to speak out about what he saw. He communicated with some of the university intellectuals in the USA. Noam Chomsky was one of those. And this was certainly not what those in power wanted. And if you read the full Pat Tillman story, it appears that an ambush was staged to kill him. He died. He was initially announced as dying from some ambush from Taliban soldiers. That was later exposed to be a complete lie. His personal belongings were burned by our military, and now it's fully disclosed he got 3 rounds in the forehead with a U.S. M16 from a U.S. soldier at an ambush that appears to have been staged. And I encourage people to read about that story, and that's what it's really about. That's what our military does, those in power. And again, there's a lot of good people in our military like Pat Tillman. They don't come any better than Pat Tillman. But when people like that truly try to take an honorable stand for the common good, that's what happens to them. That's a story that everyone should read about. All these events, all this tangled web, it all weaves together. When we look at what the power structure is willing to do to hide its crimes in its pursuit of the energy it needs to keep going, the real cost of nuclear power, for example. Here's a very recent story by Carrie Wedler about the greatest nuclear disaster in the United States that was never told. The story is from September 28th. The article states the United States government deliberately hid, quote, the worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history, according to experts, and an in-depth investigation by NBC, Southern California. Kudos to NBC for that. Not much else, but for that. Whistleblowers have also come forward to expose the little-known catastrophe which has occurred north of Los Angeles in 1959 and leaked over 300 times the allowable amount of radiation. Now, how do you have an allowable amount of radiation? As if it's not harmful at any level? That's a lie. But they have allowable levels to create the illusion in people's minds that anything below that level is safe. But we're talking now about 300 times over the allowable level of radiation into surrounding neighborhoods. That contamination is now linked to a 60% increase in cancer in the area, but the government still refuses to acknowledge its colossal mistake. The government is a criminal cabal. Just read the Pat Tillman story. Read the story from the Tillman parents, very intelligent people. Read what they've gone through to try to bring this story to light. And they finally proved again that the official government story about Pat Tillman being heroically killed in some enemy ambush was a complete lie. Just like Saddam Hussein being tied with WMD was a complete lie. Just like how many other things were fed are a complete lie. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that started the Vietnam War, a complete lie. It's on the record. Does anybody care? They're going about their lives as if nothing's wrong because they don't want to know. But there's no hiding from what's coming. There's no hiding from the unraveling that's occurring right now. In regards to this particular mistake, which I want to use as an example of business as usual for the U.S. government, continuing with this report, the article tragically was driven by America's darkest demons, from a dogmatic militarism to aggressive corporatism, and ongoing government corporate efforts to cover up the disaster are nothing short of staggering. In 1947, 2 years after the United States dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, which was completely unnecessary, by the way, if you look at the history, that's very, very clear at this point. The dropping of the nuclear bombs had to do with sending a message to other powers around the world, so that was considered okay to kill 200,000 innocent Japanese civilians. Continuing with the report, the North American Aviation Corporation opened a 2,800-acre nuclear test site in Ventura County, just miles from the San Fernando and Simi valleys, 2 adjacent valleys located north and northwest of the city of Los Angeles. North American Aviation amassed power during World War II. All these private contractors are immensely powerful, by the way. We all know that. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin involved with the climate engineering right now. They do whatever they want. So North American Aviation amassed power during World War II when it produced more aircraft than any other company and flexed its muscles as an early and powerful player in America's emerging military-industrial complex. One of its expansions came in the form of building the Santa Susana Field Lab, acronym SSFL, where researchers would perform top-secret nuclear tests involving rocket engineering, missiles, and nuclear energy and power. Continuing with the report, the worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history. That's a quote from the report. For 12 years, things ran smoothly, but on July 1st, high levels of radiation leaked from the sodium reactor experiment, acronym SRE, Workers initiated contamination cleanup and started and stopped the reactor for 2 weeks. On July 13th, however, the situation grew far more dire. A power surge occurred in one of the nuclear reactors, and employees were unable to shut it down. Whistleblower John Pace, now in his 70s, started working at the facility in January of '59 and was present on the day of the partial meltdown. He says he spoke out in recent years because his guilty conscience. Quote, "The radiation in that building got so high it went clear off the scale," Pace recalled to NBC4. They were not able to contain the radiation that was leaking from the reactor. Blaming equipment failure, Pace said the men working at the facility had two choices given to them by those who employed them. Let the reactor explode. A nuclear detonation, Pace says, would have been just like the Chernobyl reactor building blowing up. Or open the reactor and let the radiation flow out into the atmosphere. Do we blow it up, or do we let the radiation go? Pace recalled, debating. He was 20 years old. How can a 20-year-old person, employee, how does this happen in charge of this type of thing, and how does something like this happen without being reported? What kind of quote-unquote authorities do we have in our country and our quote-unquote agencies for public health that would help to hide something like this? Because they're still here now. They're still here now. California stopped testing for aluminum in water in 2002. These agencies exist to hide reality from an unsuspecting populace. Keep that in mind. So here we have this 20-year-old faced with, quote, do we blow it up or do we let the radiation go? Some workers expressed concern that the wind would blow the radiation directly into the nearby neighborhoods where their families lived. But with heavy hearts and upon orders, the report states, they opted to release the radiation to avoid a devastating explosion. NBC4 documents, quote, Pace says that the dangerous radiation was released for weeks and went whichever direction the wind was blowing. Pace says the large door in the reactor was open so they could vent the radiation from inside the building. He also remembers that the exhaust stack of the reactor was opened so that the radiation could be released from inside the damaged reactor straight into the atmosphere, end quote. Quote again, each time they started and stopped the reactor, radiation from the reactor was released, he said. In 2009, when he began to speak out about the disaster, supervisors at the facility reportedly barred employees from wearing radiation-detecting film badges, knowing that if they were warned, they would detect radiation higher than allowable limits. Pace said that he and all the other workers were, quote, sworn to secrecy, and his boss, right in his face, to make it clear, he says he and his coworkers were just following orders. Nobody knows the truth of what actually happened, he added. Just following orders. That is not an excuse. Whether you're in the military or an agency, that is not an excuse. And I ask anybody who's carrying on these efforts, whether it's geoengineering or hiding this nuclear disaster that happened in California in 1959, those who helped to hide that and everybody else involved in cover-ups like this, the actions, the consequences of your actions are manifesting around the globe. When do you come clean and tell the truth about what you're involved with? Again, those in the military, those in agencies. There's so many who know exactly what's going on, from the climate engineering to the very high levels of radiation we're being exposed to right now from Fukushima. And when our government and our agencies can hide something like what happened in California in 1959, and the final paragraph of the report states, this is the worst disaster in U.S. history, surpassing the radiation released during the 3 Mile Island accident, which I'm sure we only heard of because they couldn't hide it. This is how completely major catastrophes can be hidden, when all those involved are just, quote, following orders. Just following orders. This type of mentality needs to go. There's no room for it. Our current situation is so dire from so many directions that unless everyone pulls together to change directions, we have, mathematically speaking, no chance. So to recap again, we have a climate system that's disintegrating. We have a loss of resources. We have an increased militarization of countries around the globe. We have about 30-plus countries right now descending into chaos. Does anybody in our country really think about that between football games and whatever else people are doing? Not many are thinking about that, but they will, because as the links in the chain begin to break apart and fall out, our lives are going to begin to change very, very rapidly. I understand this doesn't seem real to people yet, although many are starting to open their eyes. It's hard not to when you see forests dying around you, when you don't see blue sky very often at all, when you either live in a dusted out, droughted out, baking California or a flooded eastern U.S. People are finally starting to realize there's a lot of things that are very wrong, but we're late in the game. We are very far into the curve. And it's been a long trajectory to get here. There should have been much more awareness, much sooner. But people have been so well programmed to not face issues, to ignore anything, everything, if they can just go on about their life from day in, day out. If I can take a big step back in time, I want to reflect at certain events in my life that were epiphanies, if you will. And I remember growing up in a very, very smoggy Southern California. It was horrible. I lived at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. The smog would bank up against those mountains, and it was so bad that there were many days that we wouldn't have recess. You couldn't go outside. You could feel it in your throat, your lungs. It was hard to breathe by the end of the day, especially if you exercised. And they would cancel baseball games and so forth. And I remember during one baseball game, I was 11 years old, and I remember this moment. It's very clear in my mind. I was 11 years old. You couldn't see a quarter mile. The smog was so thick, it was almost like a forest fire. And I remember looking at the coaches and the parents, and I was completely perplexed as to why they were not alarmed, because I was alarmed. I was extremely alarmed. And in fact, even at 11 years old, all I could think about was, I have to get out of here. I have to go somewhere else. You can't live this way. And the conditions that the parents and coaches were willing to accept were astoundingly horrific. I don't know how many people have been in that kind of smog, but that's about as bad as it gets. And then when the smog wasn't there, it was like a paradise where I lived. I first began to camp in the woods overnight without my parents when I was 12 years old. And I remember the stream that was near our house, which is where our water came from, by the way. Maybe I probably didn't have enough fluoride when I was young, and perhaps that's why things appeared a little more alarming to me. But I remember even fishing by the stream at night and catching native trouts at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains below Mount Baldy. And it was an absolute paradise. But those days were in between the massively smoggy days, if you will. And then moving to get out of that valley when I was 19 years old, I was able to finally move away and to the high desert region near Victorville, where the air was much cleaner. But as you went over the Cajon Pass, many people have heard of the Cajon Pass perhaps, it was like descending into a sea of smog. It would sit in the San Bernardino and San Gabriel valleys. And as you crest the top of that pass, it was literally like you were descending into a lake of smog. Absolutely horrible. And very few people seemed to consider that a problem, which was astounding to me. Absolutely astounding. So when we've been on this path for so long, this path of accepting, living in a cesspool of pollution and toxic waste, allowing toxic materials to be injected into our arms for the vaccinations that we have more and more study on, proving how deadly and detrimental those are. A society that thinks it's okay to put mercury in your mouth. We are truly living in an insane asylum. There's no question about that. So when the smog eventually began to flow over that pass because it was building up too much in the valleys below, and I eventually decided to move out of state, I lived in the Wallapai Mountains of Kingman, Arizona. A very beautiful sky island, just juts up out of the desert, and there's aspen trees in those mountains. Pine trees, aspen trees, and it was one of the highest property on the west-facing side of the mountains, and it was beautiful. But the trees all began to die around me there, pinyon pines and junipers. And those are very tough trees, extremely drought-resistant trees. Many of them 400 and 500 years old. So back to the agencies that try to hide everything. I would tree ring count, and you could see from the paleo data that, not just from the visible tree rings, but from other data that was available, this type of drought was non-cyclical, at least in the recent past. And I had representatives from the BLM up to my acreage to look at the tree die-off. And what did they say? They say what most agency officials say. It's all just normal. It's all just a cycle. Nothing to worry about. Go back to sleep. I'll go back to my job, and we'll all ignore everything. And I couldn't do that. I mean, clearly there was a trend going on there that was again alarming, the kind of drought and UV that we were seeing there. After a great deal of research, using the IPCC manuals. The IPCC, for those who don't know, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the largest scientific panel ever created on any subject in human history. About 2,000 plus climatologists. So, and I'm not a fan of the IPCC, by the way. Their data, many people think their data is alarmist. Here's the reality. Their data is far short of how bad things really are. But my point is, when I felt I needed to move away from Arizona, still trying to outrun the disintegrating climate, I did extensive research. This is in the late 90s, and the IPCC manuals showed the greatest amount of precipitation increase, projected increase, in the whole lower 48 in a little circle in Northern California extending to Oregon. And that's why I'm where I'm at now. Based on the best available data, I wanted to move where the projections were for the greatest increase in precipitation. These are 1,000-page manuals from the IPCC. It was the best data available. So what was missing from the IPCC studies? GeoEngineering. Because again, such panels, who are ultimately funded, as are all other agencies, all government offices, elected officials, they're all funded ultimately by those who print the money. So they're all at the end of the strings, all of them. So of course the IPCC manuals did not contain any consideration for geoengineering. So even though the area that I'm now in was predicted to have the greatest increase in precipitation, we began to see that actually. In 2005, 2006, where I live, we had 104 inches of rain. But in 2007, when the Arctic ice almost crashed for the first time, the climate engineers really went for broke over our area. And the rain has curbed ever since. So although we're told the drought is 4 years old, it's 8 years old. That's the truth. And we went from 105 inches of rain in 05-06 down to 44 inches the very next year. That's a massive drop, down to 44 inches in 06-07, down to 40 in 07-08, down to 35 in 08-09, kept dropping. In fact, by 2013, instead of our normal annual of 70 inches of rain, we got 7 inches of rain. So at a certain point, one realizes you can't outrun this when you have so many people in society that are so willing to, quote, do their job, as I stated earlier, and so many people who are willing to accept whatever their government does in pursuit of resources, and whatever their government does in order to keep the wheels of the military-industrial complex turning. Again, that's how we have incidents like the Vietnam War, started from a false flag in the Gulf of Tonkin. Does anybody care that that's how the Vietnam War started, in which nearly 60,000 of our sons and daughters, mothers and fathers were killed? Nearly 60,000. It is a historical fact that it was from a false flag event in the Gulf of Tonkin. How many of our brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers were killed in the Middle Eastern conflicts? Now, related to, it's not just the invasion of Iraq after 9/11, but if we go back even to the first Gulf War, what happened there? Saddam Hussein was basically given the green light to invade Kuwait by members of our government because they wanted that aggressive act. They wanted a reason for the conflict. And if you research this, you'll find what I'm saying is absolutely true. He was more or less told that the U.S. had no concern in what he did with Kuwait, and he took the bait. And in the next Gulf War, we now know that there was no connection with Saddam Hussein in 9/11. We now know there was no WMD. Again, just a pretext for war. And now we move on to 9/11 and the license that that gave to our government to invade, to occupy, to strip rights. And as I've gone over in past shows, when you have the top Washington military industrial hawk think tanks stating a year before that event that they needed a, quote, new Pearl Harbor to achieve their agendas of militarization and occupation, how big of a red flag should that be? When you have the grand chessboard by Brzezinski that I've also outlined in recent shows, completely laying out the exact plan we see happening right now, the toppling of Middle Eastern countries to gain control of those resources. How many red flags do we need? And how long will we stand by and do nothing while our world, our entire planet, is sacked, plundered, and pillaged, and to no greater degree than climate engineering happening above our heads, which we can't hide from? You can't hide from climate engineering. I have people emailing me constantly, where can I go to get away from the climate engineering? You'll have to find another planet. There's nowhere to hide on this planet. This is a miraculous, miraculous orb, planet Earth. And the atmosphere on our planet that allows us to live here is as thin as a layer of paint on a basketball. When we screw that up, it's game over. And it's already damaged beyond any return to what it's been. There's no question about that. It's up to all of us to engage in this battle for the common good, not just a few. And I also hear from people who are busy in endeavors that actually are participating in the power structure Ponzi scheme of financial gain. And they know about climate engineering. They don't do anything about it. They jump up and down maybe once a month when it's a particularly bad spray day, or maybe they get sick after being bombarded with these particulates. But then they go right back around their usual business. They don't do a thing for another month or 2 or 3. We don't have that kind of time to spare. We absolutely don't. As I stated at the end of my presentation in Reading in August, that all that is necessary, in the words of Edmund Burke, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. How many statements from how many wise men do we see that from? The same statement basically was made from Albert Einstein. From the Hopi elders, I also repeated this in Reading, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Us. It's imperative for everyone who truly cares about their children, about their children's future, about the future of the planet, about all of our futures, to learn what's happening and learn how you can move the ball up the field. Everyone can participate. Everyone can do an immense amount of good, but you have to try. You can't do it from the bench. It can't be done. In order to effectively move the ball up the field, you have to have some idea of what the field is. So you need to learn a little bit about what's going on. You need to take your compass heading every day to have some clarity on how fast these events are unfolding. And at any point in time, given the cards the power structure is holding, starting with the aerosol operations happening above our head, they can alter that playing field. If they alter the mix that's already toxic, as we've described in so many ways, highly toxic, if that mix is changed and made more toxic, they can level the playing field anytime they want. And ignoring these realities will not save you. Hiding in your cabin on the Titanic will not save you if the ship sinks, as I've stated before. I implore everyone to look around, look for independent sources of news. A great source, as I've stated before, is Rice Farmer. Just search Rice Farmer. He's a Japanese rice farmer in Japan. Puts out a lot of great news, no politics, no advertising. Take a look. Find out what's happening in your world. Make your voice heard. This is Dane Wigington for Global Alert News. Until next week. Thank you very much.